There was a time when millions of bison covered the American Great Plains. Not hundreds, not thousands, millions. From horizon to horizon, the ground itself seemed to move. But then, something changed. Within just a few decades, America's greatest herds began to disappear, and by the late 1800s, fewer than 1,000 bison remained. The animal that had dominated the Great Plains for thousands of years was suddenly standing on the edge of extinction. But this story doesn't end with extinction, because in one of the most remarkable conservation stories in American history, a handful of survivors would become the beginning of a comeback. This is the story of the American bison. Long before highways crossed the Great Plains, before cities spread across the American West, the bison was one of North America's defining animals. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 30 and 60 million bison once roamed North America. Their range stretched across much of the continent, with enormous concentrations across the Great Plains. They were not simply large animals wandering across empty land. Bison were part of an enormous ecosystem. They grazed the grasslands, moved nutrients through the soil, and influenced the structure of prairie ecosystems. For indigenous peoples across the Great Plains, bison were also far more than wildlife. They provided food. Their hides could become clothing and shelter. Bones and other parts could be turned into tools. And bison became deeply connected to indigenous cultures and traditions. For thousands of years, people and bison were intertwined. Then, the balance began to change. During the 19th century, the American West was transformed. Railroads crossed the continent, settlements expanded, commercial markets grew, and powerful firearms made it possible for hunters to kill bison on an enormous scale. Bison hides became valuable commodities. Meat entered expanding markets, and hunting became increasingly commercial. But there was another devastating factor. The destruction of the bison also became connected to the campaign against indigenous peoples who depended on them. The U.S. National Park Service records that the military supported the destruction of bison as a way of undermining tribes whose lives depended upon the animal. The result was catastrophic. From tens of millions, the population collapsed to fewer than 1,000 by the 1890s. Some estimates suggest that only a few hundred wild bison survived at the lowest point. An animal that had once seemed impossible to destroy was almost gone. But not every bison disappeared. A few small groups survived in remote places, and one place became especially important: Yellowstone. When Yellowstone National Park was established in 1872, roughly 1,000 bison were estimated to be inside the park. But protection alone could not immediately stop the slaughter. Poaching continued, and the population continued to fall. By 1902, only 23 bison remained. 23. That was all. A species that had once numbered in the tens of millions had been reduced to a tiny remnant. And those 23 animals would become incredibly important to the future of wild bison. The disappearance of the bison was becoming impossible to ignore. Private citizens began protecting surviving animals. Conservation efforts expanded. Protected herds were established. And in the early 20th century, government agencies began playing a major role in rebuilding bison populations. At Yellowstone, managers introduced additional bison from Montana and Texas in 1902. Protection, management, and carefully planned relocations helped the herds grow. The numbers began moving in the opposite direction, slowly at first, then dramatically. The animal that had been pushed toward extinction was beginning to return. The recovery of the bison became one of America's most important conservation stories. But there is an important distinction. The bison is no longer facing the same immediate threat of extinction it faced in the 19th century. That does not mean the story is finished. Modern conservation faces a different set of challenges. Many bison herds are small, isolated, or restricted by fences. Genetic diversity can become a concern, and conservation managers must balance bison populations with available habitat. In Yellowstone, another problem emerged. As the population recovered, bison began moving outside the park in search of food. That created complicated conflicts involving landowners, livestock, disease management, and wildlife conservation. So saving the bison was never going to be as simple as just increasing their numbers. The goal became something much bigger: to preserve healthy, genetically diverse, ecologically functioning, wild bison populations. Today, the American bison is no longer a symbol of an animal that vanished. It is a symbol of survival. But look closely, and the scars of history are still there. The bison occupies only a fraction of its former range. Many modern herds are managed rather than completely free-ranging. And conservationists continue working to restore bison, not only as an iconic animal, but as an important part of North America's grassland ecosystems. In 2024, the United States, Canada, and Mexico announced additional cooperation to strengthen bison conservation across North America. The goal is not simply to keep bison alive. It is to restore their ecological role and strengthen their future. Once, millions of bison moved across this continent. Then, almost all of them disappeared. 23 remained in Yellowstone. A few hundred survived elsewhere. And from those survivors, a species began its long road back. The American bison did not simply survive a near-extinction event. It became a lesson about how quickly a species can disappear and how difficult, but possible, recovery can be. Today, when a massive bison stands against the wind on the same Great Plains where millions once thundered across the earth, it represents something more than the American West. It represents a second chance. Because the story of the American bison is not a story about an animal that almost disappeared. It is a story about an animal that almost disappeared